So let me start my rant, and you can jump on board with me if you need to, because I had an experience yesterday, and this is partly why my wife and I like to do things and go places, to not get jaded to think that we've experienced all the things of the world, and then those things are just happenstance or they're just typical. So some of you in this gathering, even this morning, or listening to this as a recording, might have had this experience before, and I've not. So let me make the disclaimer before I start the rant. So in my younger days, less so now as I get older, I was much more of a sports guy, and not a sports to watch guy and a sports statistician guy, even though both of those things I valued. But I was a go out and do sports guy. So I love to watch baseball, but then I'm also going to go out and I'm going to play first or third base. I love to watch volleyball, but I'm going to go out and I'm going to play volleyball. I love to watch basketball, but then if I'm watching a game, I'm going out and I'm going to do or try to do some of the stuff that I've watched in the game. And so my love for sports and for especially games that are skill and that perhaps involve a ball have always been on my radar and close to my heart, especially when I was younger and had the the desire and the ability to participate ably. So the experience that I had is and let me help to separate it, and then I'm going to have you join in, and it is very related to the course of study that we do. In that, although it's a rant, I'm very disappointed, certainly in me, and then in the world at large. So when I went to school, I went to a school that had a Division I sport program. But because of the size of the school that I went to, the size of the auditoriums or the size of the venues where the sports would be practiced, perhaps at most held about 6,000, maybe 8,000 people. And I remember in my tenure, especially, and this is something that I've talked with Bruce about over the years, I remember going probably to one football game and then also going to one tailgating gathering during the course of my years in school, and neither one of those activities or attendances made me hungry enough to need to want to attend several times during the rest of my tenure in school. But I appreciated the experience and appreciated seeing something that was quite unlike the old bonfires and the old high school gatherings that we had to have homecoming events and sports days in those times as a younger person. So I had the occasion, and that's the comparative point. So I had the occasion yesterday, and I appreciated. So one of the neat things about the family relationship that we should share, and I appreciate this group of people because I think we're getting closer to that if we've not yet arrived. I think we're getting closer to that. So I appreciate when Sarah refers to us as family. I appreciate when Diane calls us out and refers to us as family, because sometimes what that says is that it's beginning to shape our thinking. So there's a commonality in our thinking even when we're away from each other. And so you hear Sarah sometimes reference the fact that when she's putting music together and I'm making music suggestions to her, sometimes we're on a wavelength and we're going, I don't know where that came from. And I think that family members sometimes share a vein of being able to be influenced and inspired in a similar fashion. So it was surprising to me, but not so bizarre, when Sarah posted on her Slack line yesterday the Liberty attendance for football, because my experience yesterday had to do with football, and I was kind of thinking, is this something I want to have us talk about or something I want us to take a look at? And when Sarah posted it, the light bulb went off and it sort of had a resounding, yes, let's just go there. So I posted a short video to let you see something that you may not have really been able to pick out as well, because my camera work is certainly not exemplary and I'm not a cameraman by any stretch. And then posting it, I sort of gave you a little bit of a blurb and insight, but then I wanted you maybe to see a little bit of a bigger picture today. So the opportunity that I had is I was invited by a very good friend of mine who was servicing kind of a high-end party yesterday, to be in the area and arena of the University of South Carolina Gamecocks football game yesterday. Now, I've got some UVA people here. I've got some Liberty people. Liberty has certainly turned into, in many ways, a football juggernaut. UVA has always been certainly among the powers in NCAA basketball, less so in football. Virginia Tech, for those of you, Tech is probably big in football. UVA has gotten bigger in football over the past years. But I don't know if any of this comes close to this Gamecocks experience I had yesterday. And let me explain to you why. I've been to professional sports and I've been to college sports in my life. And I've been to several NBA basketball games. I've never been to a professional football game or a huge college football game. And so we were positioned on a 9-story building that had very special access, not only to resources and to the persons and to the events that were going on around the football game. But if you're familiar with how sports are televised, typically when the game happens in your town, you can't see it on TV because it's blacked out. And that's to generate extra revenue. Well, this particular edifice, actually, when the game is blacked out elsewhere, it comes on a big, huge 80-inch screen so that the participants of this particular locale get to all gather on the rooftop and watch the game if they don't want to go across the street to the stadium. And when I say stadium, it's a stadium that holds 80 to 90,000 people. And so if you took a look at the pictures I showed you, the game was starting at 7 p.m. The crowd I showed you was beginning to form at 2 and 3 o'clock, if not earlier, in the afternoon. And they weren't doing anything really except celebrating that the game was going to happen. They were gathering together to get ready to go into the game that hadn't even happened yet. And I showed you sort of panning maybe of pictures of just a gathering of people that was so huge and so widespread, it was really mind-blowing for me. And then I took additional pictures and video of all of the area that was probably about a 5, maybe 10-mile radius around this stadium. And it was wall-to-wall traffic with police and people dressed in orange and people dressed in the colors of the team and canopies, not only on the ground for tailgating, people parking for tailgating, but all other buildings had the same colors draped around because there was a unity for this team as far as the eye could see. And additionally, we were there just as the game began to start. And the sound from 80,000 voices in the stadium across the street was overwhelming. You could hear them yelling and screaming, if not the fight chants. You could hear them yelling and screaming as the wave prepared them to get ready for the game. It was awe-inspiring. And it was all-consuming so that if you were in the area, you needed to plan your day around the potential disruption or participation of this entire day's event. And I looked at this. I watched the band, and I watched the pep group, and I watched the cheerleaders, and I watched the teams come in, and I watched all these people walking, parked almost a mile or so away, coming to the Coliseum. And my thinking was, a lot of these folks are united and rallying today, and they don't even know any of these people that are playing in the stadium. They're wearing T-shirts and paraphernalia of some of these teams that are sold in a store someplace, and they don't even have a relationship with any of these people that they're coming to spend an entire day to see. And it was mind-blowing. Now, this morning, I spent time at a local service here that I've been attending at the 8 o'clock service. And during the time together, one of the components in their bulletin, which we have forgotten how it works, it almost is an alien thing. It's in my hand, and I'm going, what do I do with this? But I figured it out. You've got to read it the entire way through. It tells you what comes next. And they had the feature in that we like in our bulletins that tells you impact. And that impact is going to be about morning attendance at 8 o'clock, morning attendance at 9:30 service, morning attendance at the 11 service. And the totals there, I think we're about 465 when they included 145 views from people in virtual land. That number didn't even approach the folks that you saw that I had pictured in the posted video last night. And we're supposed to be excited about being adopted into the family of the creator of the universe because he lived the perfect life for us and then was murdered for us. And it's mind-blowing to consider how lost the world at large is and how small an impact we have on it. And it's overwhelming. So when we gather today, even like this, and I appreciate us being able to do that, when you see a group of 80 to 100,000 people plus, and they're all celebratory and joyful about people they don't even know, and they spend the whole day, and we're hard pressed to do what we're doing today for almost an hour and a half, it's a shameful, embarrassing, at least for me, feeling that's probably going to take a couple days to just be alleviated. So let me shut up there and give you some time to weigh in, and then we'll start on our lesson.
Okay, so Preston, this goes back to the conversation we had just kind of touched on right before we started, right? Where priorities and people's priorities are very different, unfortunately, and they may profess to be a Christian, right? But I'm probably going to go down a road. I'm going to be kicked out of church, and that's nothing new for me. I do it on a regular basis. But they have this priority that they're like all into these sports things, and they forget that that's kind of fleeting. You know, people come and go, teams come and go, teams are good, teams suck. You know, it just depends on what the year is. But true, but their priorities are not in the right place. And unfortunately, the culture has made it so that it's easier to put your priorities in something other than a relationship with Jesus and with a church family.
A couple of thoughts came to my mind as you were talking. Number one was whenever Dr. Wimp, Lord rest his soul, would go to an event like you just described, and there were thousands and tens of thousands of people, he would actually start crying because he desired to share the gospel with every single one of them as a group, just to preach. He wanted to preach to these people. So that came to my mind. I was just thinking of Dr. Wimp, and if he'd been there at that game, he would have wanted to. He may not have, but he would have wanted to run out on the field with a microphone and say, "Hey, listen, I got something I got to tell you that's really, really important." The second thing that came to my mind was, because I'm not a sports person, and by the way, I could see you playing first base. I bet you were a fantastic first baseman. Because I'm not a sports guy, I don't fully understand the attraction of that event, except I can say that I think that it is tied to experience. It's to experience the whole thing. And it is fleeting, as Sarah said. So my thought is, we have a society today that is driven by experience. And we see this, I think, in we'll call it the religious realm, when we talk about religious gatherings that also carry with it an experience. They've got they'll have their tongues or healing or, whatever, or such and such is preaching, and you get a chance to hear, this monumental person. So I think we have a society today that is so experience driven that they are not really realizing how fleeting it is. And when it's over, it's like, okay, I got to do it again somehow else. So they're constantly seeking that adrenaline rush. And this is why we have people doing dumb stuff too. I've got to slide down a zip line so I can get that rush. And now what's next? Okay, I've got to jump a motorcycle over 18 cars. What's next? I got to do this stuff to experience these things. And I think that, and people, I think in society get that to a greater or lesser degree. I have a different kind of level of experience that I'm looking for. And it's like what Sarah talked about, making it a priority. This experience is what I enjoy because, and when we're in person, it's so much the better because there's a fellowship around someone you do know. Like you said, these people, 100,000 people watching the game in person, and they're getting no remuneration for being there. As a matter of fact, they're having to pay to do that. And they could not walk up to anyone on the field and call them by name probably. So there's really no connectivity except for the experience. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
A lot of times, Gene, I like when you use the word experience because now people are trying to sell, quote unquote, experiences for birthdays, for trips like family vacations. They're trying to sell that experience because you are right. People are thinking more along the lines of experiences versus anything else, having a close relationship or do I actually know these people? And when I say no, I mean know these people. Yeah, I may know your name on a professional football team. Doesn't mean I know who you are.
It almost sounds like the movie Total Recall, where, you go and spend some shekels and you get the experience, whether or not you've actually done it, it's all in your head. And so you
Exactly.
retain that memory in your head. Anyway.
Well, just so we all understand each other, there's only really one serious football team in South Carolina. I had to say that for my sister. And a little bit further west. Sorry. So, I love sports. I'm a Virginia basketball sports fan. Virginia football, Preston, thank you for your generous statements about them, but they've got a ways to go. But what I see about sports lots of times, people that are followers of sports teams is in a sense that they want to belong to something. They want to be able to identify with those people, and they kind of live and breathe that team's experience. And so one has to say, what are you missing in your own life? Which is a big question. Number two, I think Gene's spot on about the experience aspect of it. We are very much a recreationally minded culture. You think about the growth in professional sports over the last, even our lifetime. 150 years ago, there weren't any sports teams. There weren't any professional sports teams. This has all happened really in the since the late 19th and early 20th century. We've seen that because all of a sudden people are like, they want diversions. They don't want to be thinking about their life. They want to be thinking about something else. And for that brief time, they can get away from that. But my thought is, because I've thought about this a lot lately, about just the idea of being filled with the Spirit. I understand what Gene said about people going to churches for the experience, and that they're being sold something different than the gospel, quite frankly. But to be filled with the Spirit, which I'm not every day, I'll be honest with you, that in and of itself brings all that the scriptures talk about, and mankind just wants to gin up some sort of a counterfeit to that, whether it's in a church setting or a sports setting or whatever. And so they just haven't experienced it. And I think it all comes back to the fact that there's probably a lot of people at that South Carolina game yesterday who are churchgoers. A whole lot of people at that yesterday, right? I mean, South Carolina is a part of the Bible Belt for sure. And there may even be some faithful, really strong followers of Christ who was in that group, but a lot of them probably are church goers, but they're not so much possessors of what Jesus promises. So that's what they've kind of traded in. And then I thought you were kind of going down this path, but you didn't spend as much energy on it as I thought. I mean, just that idea they can get excited about those, I guess you did say it, get excited about those kids, but get excited about Jesus. And that comes down to, they probably know a lot more about those kids than they do about Jesus.
Agreed.
Right.
And I think the other thing too that's also kind of lended itself to this is the fact that everything is back to being open. I mean, it shouldn't have really closed in the first place, but now people are like all excited because now they can go back into these settings, right? And they can be shoulder to shoulder and they can do that. Although in all reality, that probably still could have done that last year, but that's a whole different topic. That's a whole different discussion, you know. But even the Liberty game, the videos that Nathan sent us, and I saw a couple other ones posted on Facebook last night, it was loud. Nathan even said it was loud. The stadium holds what, 20,000 people, I think, and they had just under 16,000 in attendance. So, but again, I think it's also people are feel like they can venture out of their homes now, at least for the time being.
I appreciated Bruce's comment about being in the Bible Belt and the church complement, we'll call it, that would have been at that game. I would love to see them this morning and do a comparison between their enthusiasm from yesterday and their enthusiasm or lack thereof today. That would be an interesting study.
Truth be known, they're probably talking about the game at church today.
They are.
Well, I did look it up, and this is going to freak you guys out, but when I saw it at halftime, it was 29-0. So it was almost like the Gamecocks are playing on the field by themselves. So they were probably really talking about that game.
So I would tell you, I appreciate where all of you have weighed in, and I appreciate that some of the thinking isn't too foreign or too far away from you when this is the kind of discussion, because Bruce is absolutely right. The pastor's homily today included that he was a staunch UNC football fan, and so I can tell you, and I've heard it, that during the mornings when people are gathering, they're talking about the sports from yesterday. And as a former sports participant, as a former sports fanatic, I appreciate sports, and I don't think that it's improper to talk about it briefly when we gather. But our gathering is for a completely different purpose that's supposed to then have emphasis on another encounter, another relationship that far surpasses our brief affiliative knowledge of the people on a sports field who may come or go depending on the money offered to them and opportunities this year or next. There's no faithfulness from them to us. Well, there's faithfulness from us to them, but they're not concerned about me continuing to support them as a team or even as an individual unless it's about their advertisement, their marketing, their dollars. And our society is so skewed that when I look in that crowd of 110, 120,000 people, believing that in the Bible Belt, there are a lot of church attenders, there are a lot of church professors, Jesus professors there, but I just left a service that was so dry and that was so impassionate that it leaves me feeling ineffectual, feeling that we're not able to help people to get excited about what really, really matters. That folks were much more excited about a periphery of relationship missed that existed yesterday versus connecting with the very creator of the universe. And not only is it a little bit disappointing, when I really start thinking about it, I get a little miffed. And I get a little miffed at us who are supposed to be possessors and professors. I get miffed. And it's bothersome. And then it makes me want to redouble or triple my efforts if I can to say, guys, we need to put our excitement, we need to put our passion where it in the right basket, because there's nothing fundamentally yesterday that has any eternal value whatsoever. Yet it didn't stop inspiring folks in a 10-mile radius to give their all during the fullness of a day when they weren't doing anything except simply anticipating to be in the moment. They were simply anticipating being let in to what they thought was hallowed ground amongst set-aside people. And those set-aside people were college football athletes. And that's disappointing that we've not been able to influence our country and our world to the point where they understand that that is so many levels below having a relationship with the creator of the universe and the author and finisher of our faith. So let me quiet there and give you a moment to chime in if you want to, and then you'll hopefully see how this will continue to flow right into our study.
Preston, it's not the same thing, but it is the same thing. I shared with you about the guy in my church who was giving me chapter and verse on the QAnon thing a couple of weeks ago. And I'm not here to say whether any of that's right or wrong, as far as if you guys know QAnon and just all the conspiracies that are going on around the world. But the part that has had me mad, literally, for the last 3 weeks since we had that lunch conversation, is that he could give me facts and figures and people and dates and times and all of that. And then when I was in a Bible study like the week before after that, I said, can you guys tell me the 4 verses of the Romans Road? Couldn't pull it out of his hat. Could not do it. And this is one of the guys, if he was part of this group, he'd be here today because he's a cool guy in the church. Right. And you know, the thing that has been is number one, well, I won't go there. The thing that's really been grinding me is that this guy supposedly is this great Christian. And he really goes into battle with a wooden sword if he can't even cobble together 4 verses out of scripture. I mean, I am sorry. That's pretty lame. But, you know, it just speaks to that idea that I think one of the reasons that we struggle so much with this is that most of the people that are populating churches every given Sunday or whatever, because I'm just going to say it that way, people populating churches have no idea what they've got their hands on. They have literally no idea what they've got their hands on. You know, they think because they you know, show up, pitch some bucks in the tray and you know, say hallelujah or praise God at the right time, that they're in good shape. And people coming in look at them and go, really, you're not any different than me. So I just see it as more part and parcel of the fact that there are so many other things important in believers' lives than knowing the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, knowing his word and making it authentic in their lives. And they don't even think about Jesus outside of when we're together. It's absolutely front of mind, and other than, you know, when it's right in front of them. Otherwise, they've got 100 other things they're dealing with.
As we discuss being a slave to Jesus, this is a terrific relaunch point to just continue jumping into our study right now, because if you're in position to be a slave or a servant, and the only time you think about your duties is when you get asked to do something, then it may suggest that you're only duty oriented and that your real commitment is to not getting yelled at, as opposed to how do I effectively serve? How do I effectively make myself available? How do I anticipate the needs? And how do I prove myself to be not only a good steward, but one who loves my master? and again, I'm using some terminology that's going to get some of us a little bit peeved as Americans, but that's the topic of our study right now. And so if it's only in the front of your brain when somebody presents to you, oh, you're supposed to be a servant of Jesus, and that's the only time you think about it, then I would suggest that you're really stinking up the party. You're really stinking up the ball. But at the same time, I'm with Bruce believing that kind of thinking permeates a lot of folks who are in attendance at some worship service today across, if not the United States, perhaps the world, at least the Western world. So last week we ended on a question. Actually, we didn't even end on a question. We discussed a whole question. And it's good to move the ball at least a couple inches toward the first down. So I want to congratulate you all for helping me take the ball that far last week. But it was a great question. And it was talking about what's the difference between a good and a bad servant. and Terry helped us to wade into the water. That was a discussion about how do we show love for people when in many ways their behavior is counterintuitive to what the Bible says, and it causes us to be so judgmental that it perhaps interrupts how we can create a relationship with those people to be able to effectively talk about Jesus to those folks. And we talked about a variety of answers, but also helped to put us on the path to consider that as believers, we do have the ability to judge behavior. We don't have the ability to judge relationship with Jesus, even though, as Jerry mentioned last week, we can be fruit inspectors, but it's not our job to be able to be the arbiters of if they're really saved through Jesus or if they're not. But it is our job to, for instance, a piece of news today is Mayor Pete Buttigieg and his spouse have just had, a new baby. And he also, thank you, he also purports to be a Christian. The odd part about, especially what Terry presented to us last week, is if I were in this man's life, even as high profile as he is, I would have to take him to scripture to say to him, you can't be a Jesus believer and practice the lifestyle and have the beliefs that you have. They simply don't coexist. And it's almost like, and again, I'm thinking about Terry with this good and bad servant discussion from last week. We had our current president right now tell us that he's upset that the state of Texas has decided that they're going to create anti-abortion laws to be able to protect life. Now, the issue that I have here is not necessarily one from a Democrat-Republican standpoint. It's from this. We've got a gentleman who purports to be a Catholic. And at the very least, the Catholics are known for their positions on life. So I don't understand how you can be a professed Catholic and then say that abortion is an okay practice, because just like the Ten Commandments, when the Lord says, thou shalt not, it's not kill, thou shalt not murder. And when we premeditatively abort new life, that is murder. And then on top of that, the other thing that he said is this, and this almost harkens back to President Obama when he was in office several years back. The president said this: there was a time, I'm paraphrasing, there was a time when I believed that life began at conception, but I no longer believe that. As a believer, if I'm in the presence of President Biden and he's going to purport to me to be a Christian, I've got to say, President Biden, I can't really understand that. I can't understand how you can say that when that throws the very directives, the very ability to be obedient to Jesus in Jesus's face. I don't get it. And so I understand Terry saying we seem to have a whole lot of biases and prejudices that keep us from being effective, but then we also sometimes get afraid of being able to stand for the truth, depending on how unflattering a light it puts us in, or potentially how we think that the outcome is going to negatively impact either me or maybe the other party. But I would suggest to you, and before I give a break here, that the Lord says that he came certainly as a servant to bring a sword. And that sword is when you bring the gospel and the truth of who the Lord is, it doesn't necessarily make for warm fuzzies. It creates a conflict with the things I want to do and the values I want to have versus those that my creator says I should have. That would allow me to have the most qualitatively effective and contributory life. So let me back off there and give you some time to respond or disagree, or as we jump into perhaps another question.
I think sometimes, Preston, and I can't really speak for Biden because I really don't know much about, other than the fact of what he probably didn't do for 50 years already before he became president. But, you know, sometimes people mold, is that the word I want? Mold or change their beliefs to fit in with the crowd, to fit in with the popular kids. You know, and maybe I'm wrong in saying that, but sometimes I think that people sell their beliefs because they want to be in the in group. They don't want to be on the outskirts and be um
Ostracized.
ostracized. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. I was trying to say it at the same time. So again, we're on the same wavelength.
And I would suggest it's different in the case of Obama and Biden a little bit, in the sense that it's not necessarily like I don't want people to separate me because I hold these beliefs. It's a more of the sense of the majority of the party and the people that I want to vote for me hold these beliefs. And because of that, I'm going to say, hey, guess what? I'm with you guys. Vote for me. That's really what it is. And so what it really comes down to is the positions that I desire to hold are more important to me than the relationship that I have with Christ. That's what it comes down to.
Generalize that just a little bit more. It's what I want to do, not what God wants me to do. I mean, I think to Preston, a time before we moved out here, where we had some single people in our church that you had to call out because they were more interested in kind of having some extracurricular activities that we wouldn't approve of than they should have, and you had to call them out on it. You know, I know what the Bible says, but I want to do this other thing. So I will figure out a way somehow, hook or crook, to either bend the scriptures to fit my way or ignore what I need to ignore.
I don't know that some of the questions that we're pondering through this study are those that occupy us daily as believers. And that's what I hope impacts us, is that some of the content, some of the discussion is that might make this a regular visitation every day, as opposed to just on Sunday. Do I take my own measure in terms of how effective I've been as a bondservant to Jesus? So some of the discussion points, especially those things that you're hearing Sarah add, Steve add, look, they've got some humor attached to them. Part of the reason that they have some humor attached to them is because they're us. And sometimes handling or facing head on the idea that we're on the wrong trajectory perhaps is going to create some nervous laughter. And I'm okay with that, as long as we are honest and candid about dealing with the fact that regularly we choose the trajectory that doesn't honor Jesus. And that flies in the face of a prayer I heard this morning that said this, and I hope maybe it'll impact you the way that it did for me. It said, sometimes we fail you. And when I heard that, and again, I heard a lot today about social justice and about that kind of stuff, because the church is in position right now that if it wants to especially continue to have people giving their dollars and continuing to participate, you got to talk about the issues of the day. Now, I think talking about the issues of the day is fine, but you can't turn Jesus into a social activist. That's not who he was. But I can tell you that a lot of our church platforms are being used to do just that, to address some of these big headline issues by saying that that's what we're supposed to be about, is social justice. And that's not it. Social justice, again, is a fleeting kind of thing, as opposed to the eternal contribution that we can make by helping people. And again, you've heard me share this mantra that my wife and I share with our kids, which is this: it's to your consequence negatively if you don't want to be a believer in Jesus. If you don't want to follow, no, if you don't want to believe that Jesus did what he did and that he's who he is. But I would tell you it's to our immediate benefit if you all just follow what he said. If you just do what he said, even if you don't believe in him, do what he said. It's going to eliminate all of the social injustice and inequality if we do what he said. But we'd rather not do that, because if we do, then that suggests that because he's right, or maybe he's right, that maybe my responsibility lies deeper. And why do I want to put myself in that position if I like my own trajectory? And that, of course, for an American means I am a slave or servant to no one save my own needs. Which leads us to the next question. How long does it take to become a good servant? And I'll even partner that with this one. How long does it take to become a good servant? And how do you know when you are ready for the work?
For being a good servant, Preston,
Yep. Yep.
it probably varies from person to person,
Yep.
because it's going to depend. Because I think I said, I don't think there's a specific timeline. It may come easy to some, but others may have to actually work harder at it, just because of the way that they're wired. And a servant needs to ensure they understand expectations, and that trying to understand those expectations of the master, right? That may
Yep.
take some time for people. That's why we have a Bible, and sometimes you can read the same passage a year later and get a different meaning from it. Not that it's a bad, like the first one you had was wrong. It's just now you're like, oh, I can see this in that passage too, right? So, and it takes time, and people also need to realize that even though it may take me longer than it takes Gene to do something, it doesn't mean I'm a bad servant.
That's
It
right.
just means that I need to spend a little more time, understand the expectations, and then also developing that within myself. So people need to not give up, right? At the
Yep.
first sign of taking longer than somebody else, because we should not compare ourselves to others in that arena. And I think people get hung up on that because they're like, oh my goodness, I've been coming here for the same amount of time as this person, and look how far they are, but I'm still trying to figure it all out. It's not wrong, and it's not
Right.
bad. It's just the way that you think, right? So, but it could take time, and it could vary from person to person.
I think one of the variables in that can be your BC life, your before Christ life. Bill Hughes came to mind. Before he came to Christ, he was a Jehovah's Witness. He knew something about servants. He knew something about devotion and adherence, and he knew something about the servitude that he had been used to. And then all of a sudden he realized he had a new master that he needed to please, and that transferred over, and he went, okay, this is what I really ought to be devoting myself to. And I think that somebody who comes from that kind of background, or a background where they're already all in, will allow them to be more all in when it comes to Christianity. If you come from maybe an ambivalent background where you've not been devoting yourself to anything, it could take more time. So I think that's one of the factors. It is varying with every individual. You can have some folks that, and we've talked about this last week, I think, folks who have a different background that have, lived a life that's already challenged spiritually, and then find out who Christ is and who he is to them, then all of a sudden they are, again, a lot more devoted to whom, the one who's been forgiven the most is going to love the most. That's going to be a variable as well. So, and both of them have to do with background. So yes, I think it's going to be varying. Unfortunately, the folks that have been regular churchgoers, okay, they've been attending an evangelical church for all their life, and they finally get to the place where they trust Christ as Savior, they may not change quite as much because they've actually gotten into this groove of doing things, and they're like adding this one other thing, and they felt like they've already been devoted, perhaps. I think it varies quite a bit depending on the background.
Yeah, I think the answer that's on the magic board is it takes until the master makes and pronounces you ready for service. And some of that might be oral, it might be verbal, but there's an endorsement that you get. It's probably easy to think about this from your employer versus maybe a master servant, because that language doesn't work so well for Americans. But when you take a new job, frequently you have an initial employment period. Sometimes we call it a probation period. It lasts about 3 months, 6 months. And during that time, you go through a training incubation. And when they release you from that training cocoon into the partial real or the fully real environment, you're supposed to be ready for the work. And so from an employment standpoint, that's in some ways how we do that. If you were to work on an estate, say a grand estate, and on that estate were hired gardeners and cooks and maids, a butler, a chauffeur, they would all have different jobs. And if not the master, the person who was managing the staff would let them know when indeed they are ready for service. And it's going to be different depending on what it is that the servant needs to embrace, how swift and how quickly an adept a student they are, how eager they are to learn to be good servants. Because one of the things I didn't say here is this, that sometimes being a good servant includes making mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes, if given the right correction, help to produce a person who understands that's not the right course of action. And that's a learning opportunity as well. And when Gene talks about people's BC, their before Jesus kind of environment, well, sometimes I would say almost the best people that are they're not predisposed, but the best folks perhaps who are fertile ground for being good servants are the new believers. They're eager, they're hungry, they're ready for the race. They're ready to run. Not only are they ready to sprint, but they're ready to do like a marathon sprinting until they hang out with us for about 6 months. Then pretty much what they're ready to do is galum, galum, galum. And then our philosophy gets to be slow and steady wins the race, even if that takes 80 years. Galum, galum, galum. So sometimes the race is 80 years long. And I would suggest that it is, especially for those of us called to be servants. It's as long as you live. You're not supposed to retire from what that is. But it doesn't mean that your excitement for what you do, that your preparedness for what you do, that your ownership of what you do isn't done with a sense of excellence and a sense of excitement all the time. And when I compare my football experience yesterday, watching the excitement in the air, the supercharged air for 10 miles in anticipation of something that hadn't even started yet, and my experience this morning, maybe not even with us, which is, less than the very best expression we could have, because holidays interrupt our priorities. Holidays become our new priorities. But also attending a worship service this morning and watching people so solemn and so serene and so sincere that it literally drained the fun, drained the energy out of my desire to go, this is something I want to do. And yet I continue to commit to doing this, in part so that I have at least a fair evaluation, to not sit and talk with us about what might have been or what kind of looks like it is, but really what does happen in a world outside of what our own corporate gathering that sometimes is virtual, but also is in person. There's just not a whole lot of excitement in Mudville for Jesus. And there is excitement about people being servant. But the service is interesting, because today somebody was asked to give their testimony, and their testimony, it did that thing I talk about. It talked about them being a young kid. And then since then, they've been involved in the type of church they've been involved in, and they've been involved in community outreach that addresses students with needs. So they spent more time kind of talking about these service elements that are a part of the church that they belong to, that have an impact, as opposed to the reality of Jesus right now and last week. And that's dismaying. That really tends to burst my excitement bubble when I get to hear a person's resume based on kind of the companies and the corporations and their time as a CEO doing and working in a service capacity, as opposed to, this is what Jesus inspired me to do yesterday. And not only was he real 20, 30 years ago, but he's just as real, if not more real, today. So let me take a break there, give you time to respond if you want to.
Hey, Preston, one thing I see as a difference between going to see a college football game with 80,000 people and discussing religion, talking about God and his works and his teachings is, we're taught to have a reverence for God. Be still and know that I am with you. Be still and know that I am your God. A lot of the Bible does sort of teach to, being that still person, being that in touch, in tune person, even though Psalms will say, there's lots of singing and praising and people, acting like they're at a football game. There's kind of a contradiction there too. And I think a lot of people, including myself, I like to reflect on that solemnness and the quietness. And it puts me into that kind of mood that's not, the boisterous cheering for a football team. It's being still. So I don't know. It is kind of a contradiction, but I understand what you're saying. We should be more excited and more passionate. I don't know if the word's excited, but more passionate, outwardly passionate in our faith. But churches don't really teach that, as you noted over and over and over this morning. Especially the churches I grew up in, sit still in the pew, stop fidgeting. You don't raise your hand in church. You don't talk. You're there to listen. And we kind of program ourselves that way.
So I'm going to shut up for a bit and let you guys respond to that, because I think Terry's right on target. So how do we respond when Terry says, our churches have programmed us to be serene, solemn, and silent and still, and listeners only?
He's probably got a pretty valid point there, because think about it. Most services, you sit there, you listen to the guy, you go home, and that's about it. I mean, that happens, right? The same thing in Sunday school. A lot of times we're programmed to regurgitate what we have learned over and over and over again, right? You don't actually go very deep into anything because nobody wants to go deep into anything. So I think Terry's got a pretty decent point there, where churches have done probably a really poor job of igniting what Terry calls, a passion, right? Because you just kind of, I like your, you can put your music in here, Preston, the OEO and off to work we go. We just, sometimes churches get into the programs and their traditions as opposed to going a new way and figuring out, what does it all mean?
I blame the Puritans. I'm serious. When you think about it, uh, the the overarching mentality of the Puritan was they're afraid somewhere, someplace, somebody is having a good time. That was what they wanted. They wanted to avoid that, and there was in their mind a sense of any sort of enthusiasm in the house of God was disrespectful to God. And that was their attitude. And yeah, there is a be still and know that I am God. There is a holiness. There that is all true. But at the same time, there is a balance because I believe uh Preston says it numerous times. Jesus was the guy that the kids wanted to hang out with. Kids don't sit still and be quiet very, very well.
Oh.
So he was not enforcing that upon them. They wanted to be with him because he was the fun dude to be around. And so I think that there's a balance. Yes, we have to have reverence. We have to have understanding of the decorum, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, I think that there are a lot of times, I mean, listen, Jesus disrupted church by making a whip. Think about that, okay? Let's go into Thomas Road and start swinging a whip around and see what happens. See if you don't get tackled by part of the Liberty football team, because that's what's going to happen. We Jesus wanted us to understand that where there is enthusiasm for the things of God, and at the same time balance that with decorum and be still. And I think what it may come down to, and this may be the balance, I could be wrong here, so you guys weigh in. I think that the be still and decorum is when we're listening to him personally. And then when we're together at the game, if you will, get excited.
I like that last point you made there, Gene. I've been guilty. I have literally been guilty of creating that environment when I used to have a choir and I led it. And I can remember we used to sometimes begin with that choral prelude, "The Lord is in his holy temple." You know, I mean, please forgive me, anyone who had to go through that. I mean, it's a great song, but it wasn't the way to start a service. I mean, it really wasn't. Two thoughts. One, I think the reason a lot of people, and again, we're talking right now about church attendance. I understand that. And there's 160 odd other hours of the week to do something for Christ. But one, I think a lot of people have a problem with going because things aren't done excellently. The Sunday school teacher's dry. The preacher's dry, the music stinks, and right, and I mean, so it becomes an obligation. I go because I have to, but as soon as I can get out of here, it's just it's a different sport than what you went to yesterday. But think about the movie Major League, right? I mean, the people that were going to see the Cleveland Indians, they were very excited. They went because they felt like they had to, because they had season tickets. But they weren't excited. They were probably, you know, doing everything but watching the game because it reeked. And so there's that thought. You know what turned a corner for me, and I don't remember if I was pastor yet or still leading music or where it was, but was that idea of Gilgal, and the idea that we actually should come to worship on Sunday morning or whenever it is to gather together to celebrate the victories with each other, and then get the orders for the next week to go back into the battle. And I think if we come to that idea that when we gather together, it is to celebrate what Christ has been doing in us and through us for the last 7 days, it's going to change it. But there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be going, well, he didn't really do anything for me this week. Well, that wasn't him, man. That was you. So it's got to change that idea. It's not about a destination. It's just a point in the week in our service to the Lord as slaves.
I think a wonderful, effective response to Terry's valid comment that the understanding of church in our Western and our United States world today is a once a week potential event that is supposed to be serene, solemn, terse, traditional, and something that has a very serious tone to it. But I think both Gene and Bruce said some really beautiful things. And one of the things that Gene says is balance. I know when I go to a real dry as toast church service, there's no balance there. What there is there's just what Terry talked about. It's serene, solemn, traditional, and thou shalt only contemplate thy navel kind of understanding during the course of you being there. But it's not juxtaposed at all with the balance that Gene talked about, which is where's the joy, where's the exuberance, where's the I've been waiting all week to do this. Because there's really not that kind of sense in many of our gatherings when we get together on Sunday. Now, here's the other thing that Bruce said more beautifully is we're talking a little bit about participation in a service that happens on some day of the week. But I'm not talking about that as the be all end all. I'm just talking about that as a point along the segment or along the line that's drawn, or the ray that says we do this regularly, but it's kind of a culmination of all the other stuff that's gone on, because in many ways, the other stuff is more important. When we get together, there's just so much overflow that we can't contain it. And not only can we not contain it, it lasts more than an hour, because Bruce has got to tell me the magnificent things he's experienced, but at the same time, Gene's got to tell me the burden down that he's been experiencing. And here's the okay part about that. Gene gets to walk out a little lighter because vicariously, he's a part of the victorious team through Bruce. And Bruce gets to carry some of Gene's luggage because we get together to do that for the very purpose of re-equipping to go back out to do battle as servants.
One other little thought that came to my mind, and forgive me, this is a Bible thought. Be still and know that I'm God. Tell that to King David dancing in front of the ark. Just my thought.
I appreciate Terry giving the real life presentation of what, if we're honest, what our experience with most churches and church attendance is. And my thinking when Terry was saying that is, in addition to the things that you all shared, was show me in the Bible where boring is what the Lord commands to say, when thou shalt gather, thou shalt boreth my spiritual pantseth off. When I see worship in the Old Testament, there is a fear and an awe about that, because people are gathering for the first time when they're gathering. But I'll tell you, Abraham looked like he really loved worshiping the Lord. Isaac seemed to love like he really loved worshiping the Lord. Jacob loved worshiping the Lord so much he would entice him to take him on. Joseph loved worshiping the Lord. Now, we're not talking about the huge gathering that comes after the Lord establishes the Hebrews as his special people. But when he does do that, the idea is not necessarily for them to sit in a group of 1 million and listen to a boring sermon and then go, all right, who's got the cows ready so we can eat them? It's supposed to, in fact, the Lord's prepared them that they don't need to go have lunch because they've already got lunch collected from the manna. And the Lord did that so that they could devote a day to being in his presence, celebrating that his Shekinah glory was in and amongst them. And then, just like Gene says, when I take a look at King David, when I take a look at Ezra reading Deuteronomy, when I take a look at Nehemiah, I'm looking at folks that look like they love worshiping the Lord. And I haven't even gotten to the New Testament yet. When people just love hanging out because probably they're going to have a real good potluck, see fishes and loaves. Kids are invited, see feeding the 15 to 25,000. And Jesus says, we don't have a children's ministry here because it's probably cool for your children to see all of us worshiping together. So permit those little kids to come and hang out, because their heart is what y'all sometimes lack. That's why you're trying to keep them away from me, because you think it's supposed to be serene, silent, and boring, and it's not. So we don't sometimes put and balance the scripture together when we read it, because we're probably more influenced by the traditions that we've experienced. And we don't sometimes recognize the history to harken back, like Gene said, to understand that for the most part, as much as I love our Puritan influence, it pretty much sucked the fun out of the United States in terms of faith and relationship with Jesus.
Okay, I'm going to add one more name to this entire discussion. This is not a Bible name, but for some of you, it will be a familiar name. And if it isn't a familiar name, I'll be glad to explain it. What we're talking about is the mentality brought to us by Dolores Van Cartier. And if that's not familiar to you, I'll be glad to explain that.
Why don't you go ahead and do that, Gene? The only problem
Yeah,
with
I
some
don't,
of us.
I don't know who that is, Gene. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, okay. Very good, Terry. I am glad to explain that to you. Dolores was a lounge singer in Reno, and she ended up in a situation where her lover, boyfriend, married boyfriend wanted her dead. And that was not good for her health. So she left Reno in order to get protection so that she could witness against him so that he could go away for a very, very long time. And they hid her in a convent. Now, here's a lounge singer going into a convent where things, as we've already mentioned here, church is not done well. As a matter of fact, it's done everything but well. It's done badly. And she's a musician. So she wants to do things well. And she brings a whole idea of doing things well and making it enjoyable to this convent and to church that's associated with the convent. And all of a sudden, folks begin to realize that church can be fun. Church can be enjoyable. And Dolores, undercover as Sister Mary Clarence, was the one to bring this church along, this convent along, and help people to realize that God is fun. Now, she was not doing it from a spiritual perspective by any stretch of the imagination, but she was bringing people along to understand the difference between, and she says it, going to church is a drag. That's her words. People like going to casinos. People like going to football games, like Preston has talked about. Dolores really got that much, and I think we need to get that more.
Brought to you by Sister Acts 1 and 2.
Sister Act, yes. I was just realizing I didn't mention the movie. It's all fictitious. It is a couple of movies that Whoopi Goldberg did back in the day, Terry. And if you want to have some fun, those are fun movies. When I first saw them advertised, I thought, oh no, that's going to be sacrilegious. That's going to be. I was in that camp, and then I said, no, I can't watch that. It's going to be terrible. I did watch it, and I had a blast.
I saw both those movies and I enjoyed them. Yeah, with the family even. Yep.
So now you recognize the name Dolores Van Cartier.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
And these are documentaries that are ancillary scripture references to be able to help us apply our faith. Again, authored by Dolores Van Cartier and excellently scripted. So you can even get the movie if you don't have access to the literature. I know, Steve. It's very sad. When we talk about servantdom, when we talk about being a bondservant to Jesus, and we're taking a look at the questions, how long does it take to become a good servant? So the magic board, you can see it says, it takes until the master makes and pronounces you ready for service. And this could be a very, very short time for some, longer for others, depending upon their individual diligence and attentiveness. So You guys know, if you're not parents, it may be yourself. When you were in school, there were some courses that came really easy to you, and there were some that you had to work at. And I might even suggest there were some grades that really came easy to you, and then there were some grades that you had to work at. I remember this in high school. I was floating along pretty much until junior year. And junior year, I had honors English, and honors English kicked my tail because all of a sudden I had to do something I didn't really have to do until honors English, and that was study. And I studied so hard in honors English that I failed. And if those of you who went to school in the United States at some point in time, you recognize you must pass English in order to graduate. So I was caring very little about honors English and chemistry. I might add, I failed chemistry, but chemistry I didn't need because I had already gotten into school and my GPA was already a certain level and my board scores were already a certain level. So I pretty much was mailing in the two classes I hated, and they were honors English and chemistry. So I didn't need to pass chemistry, and thank the Lord I had a great guidance counselor who skirted me through that, but I needed to pass English. And I needed to buckle in and pay a kind of attention to this class that I had never paid in school before. And that meant I had to go back and I had to read and thoroughly immerse myself in the literature. I had to memorize stuff, and not only memorize it, I had to know what it meant, and then I had to recite it. And I had to do that at a point so that my GPA by the end of the year would be passing. And it took a recitation of Shakespeare at the end of the term that was going to be my deciding grade. Now, thank the Lord, I got 100 on that. And that brought me to the point where I wasn't failing English and was able to eventually graduate. Actually, this was my senior year? I don't remember. But I'm saying that to say how this illustrates this point of plugging in is that sometimes we all have to plug in differently based on how we're skilled, based on our experiences, based on maybe the knowledge we have coming in or what we don't have coming in. And that sometimes dictates not only how attentive we have to be, but how effective we can be. Understanding our own learning curve and understanding what it takes for me to be able to address the needs of my master qualitatively. And sometimes what that means is I've got to throw all the things out that make me comfortable, that make me familiar, that make me feel good about me. I got to throw those out the door, and I've got to adopt a whole bunch of new practices. That was my honors English year. I had to do things that said, I don't like studying. I don't like studying late. I don't like studying stuff that looks like it's not in a foreign language, but it's in Middle English. I don't like this stuff. I don't care about art. I had to figure out how to care about that stuff if I was going to be effective in terms of my application to the course. Now, I can tell you, 100 years later, it was one of my favorite courses, and it was one of the best teachers I ever had because he didn't cut me any slack because of what my GPA, my reputation was. He made me work and scrape for everything. And I can tell you what it did is it shaped my college career. I was ready now to study when I went to college, even though I kind of goofed off the first 2 semesters. But I knew how to buckle in and do it because I figured out, at least in this case, how to humble myself and to be ready for the work if I wanted what the rewards were from the labors. So let me back off there and give you some room to key in.
I'm actually appreciating your having shared that experience because I basically coasted through high school. I never took chemistry. I could do English. I was very proficient at English. And so I by the time it was all done, I actually dropped out of high school and went back to go to night school and took a test to find out where to start me, and they didn't have anything to teach me. So I could either wait 6 months or until I was 18, and then I could take the test for GED. Well, this is April before I turned 18 in October. So I had to work 6 months anyway. So I did, I took the test, got a GED. And because I'd never had that teacher and that buckling down like you talked about, I really didn't know how to study for college. And so they actually had to put me on academic probation and send me to what had been referred to as Sleep 101, basically a rudimentary study class to learn how to study. Because, I mean, fifth grade is typically where you write your term papers. I never wrote a term paper. My fifth grade teacher, well, long story short, I called her a skyscraper teacher. She was story after story after story in the classroom and not really teaching. So I never got that. So I failed in college quite a bit because of that. I appreciate knowing that I was not the only one in this esteemed group. Thank you very much.
You guys are talking about that.
I'm sorry, Bruce.
What? You need to finish your thought there, Gene?
Well, I just had one other quick thing. I apologize. I meant to say this. I've been just deliberating whether to do this. Preston said that he had to pass English to graduate. Does that apply to immigrants as well?
If they'd like to be nationalized, yes.
They're probably better at English than we are, truth be known.
Bravo.
Just one thought to add to it, not to get into all of our stories of difficulties in school, but I had that class when I was a sophomore, algebra 3, and I was getting killed in that. I was getting killed in that. My parents recognized that, and I mean, I was dying. I was dying in there. As it would happen, the Lord had provided 2 doors down. My neighbor was a professor at William & Mary in math. And so Dad went over to him, and I was mortified. But Dad went over to him and asked him if he would come tutor me in algebra 3. And I think my parents were paying him like $25 a lesson, and that was a lot of money in 1977. But Jim came over, I think, I don't know, once a week or twice a week, some weeks. And we would sit down with my homework, and he would take me through it. And the beauty of it is he didn't do my work for me, right? He would help me figure the print. And it wasn't even about the actual problem. It was to understand the underlying principle behind the problem. And I remember that first time I went into class, and my teacher, Mr. Boston, who was crazy. I think he was crazy. But he would call on different people in class to answer the question. And up until then, I could never answer the question. And that day that I went in and he asked me, Mr. Pratt, and I was able to give him to solve the problem and give the solution. And he gives me a nod, and I thought, success. So there's a lot to be said for having someone come alongside you.
So the idea is not to tell all of our sad academic stories. But this is probably the best example for Americans without a servant master attitude to understand committing yourself to get to the point of excellence. Understanding that sometimes your commitment takes you being humble enough. And I love that Bruce said this. I was mortified when my parents had to see, and here's the cool thing. Bruce didn't seek out the help himself. Somebody that he trusted had to see him struggling and say, I need to get you help. And here's why that's important. We should be doing that in this triage facility that is a worship environment, and we do not do that. In fact, if I were to tell Gene, or if Gene were to tell me, I think you're struggling with your conduct, my response typically to him is, how dare you? Who are you to judge me? And see, this goes back to Terry's question of last week. He can judge my behavior, and he can also judge my struggles. He can't judge that I don't have a relationship with the Lord. But here's the thing. Where he in some ways is treading water, I don't even know how to swim. But I'm also not humble enough to say, can somebody teach me to swim? And that's what our environment should be able to do, is to look amongst us, to watch the life struggles we have, to see potentially the fruit we are or aren't bearing, and to say, hey, dude, hey, dudette, do you need help there? And maybe even in some situations where perhaps there's trust and relationship, go and get us the help that we need. Because the next question that reads, how do you know when you're ready to or when you're ready for the work? And I love that Bruce presents, because look, good teaching is this. It's not about answering the problem, because answering the problem, you can memorize the answer to the problem. You have to understand the concept behind the posing of the problem. And that's not, in our society, when we train and teach people today, we're teaching them to answer questions as opposed to constructively and creatively and critical think. So they can answer the question, but if you ask the question and rephrase it differently, you've now just sideswiped most people because they don't believe they're prepared to answer the new question as proposed. So how do you know when you're ready to or ready for the work? When the work does, and this is what Bruce described, he didn't say this, when the work doesn't feel like an inconvenience. When people call on you and you're almost proud, you're almost going, Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter, ooh, ooh, ooh. When you're doing an Arnold Horshack to answer the question, because at this point, when somebody asks you a Bible scripture, or asks you, what's one of the passages of the Romans Road? What's John 3:16 about? And you're not going, don't ask, don't call on me, don't call on me, don't, and you're going, bring it, bring it, bring it. Because you're ready. That in some ways says that it's not inconvenient for you. When you understand the expectations, when we gather like this today, one of the things we need to expect is it's okay to say, how's your conduct? How has your conduct been? That's not an off base or an incorrect question in this crowd of people who say that we believe Jesus died for us and we profess and possess that. So having your conduct checked is not something that should freak God's people out. We should be insulted by that. Sorry. When team members declare you competent. Now, those team members have to be competent and effective themselves. So I'm not talking about what Sarah talked about earlier, hanging out with the in crowd, because it's real easy for instance, you to join the church choir and everybody's pretty awful, and the church choir thinks, man, we just killed it this week, and everybody's singing on the wrong page of the hymnal. So we're talking about a competent team declaring you ready for the team. Sorry, and I'm jumping down here. When you know the responsibilities, and I like this one the best, when you can effectively teach others the duties. When you know the responsibilities and you can effectively teach others the duties. Those are the criteria that I have up that say, this is when you know as a servant that you're ready, that you are ready for the work. So let me quiet down there, give you a chance to respond if you want to. Steve has done this thing that has become a part of our own DNA, and I don't know that folks understand it as becoming a part of our DNA as much as I appreciate it. And here's what it is. Steve helps to put his finger on the pulse of what's weird in our culture today, and he's found materials that are maybe easier to grasp and to own than our discussions here. He's grabbed snippets that are 10, 12 minutes or less that are YouTube oriented, and YouTube rules the day in our culture today. And so Steve has created this mechanism that is a part of kind of how we operate that we now just consider the norm. In fact, we anticipate and look forward to it. When you immerse yourself in some of these materials that Steve's presented, that equips you to better be a teacher, to better own what it is that we're doing when we gather, not just as a checkpoint, not in a have to kind of, but I own it, I embrace it, I understand the concept. Ask me. Ask me, I'm ready. This is one of those preparatory schools, preparatory curriculum to help us to better be public possessors of that which we profess. And if we embrace this well enough, it's going to give us the skills to teach others. And here's the other thing too. You've heard me say it a million times, and I'll only mention it briefly. The reason I do what I do today is because somebody else in a congregation said, I think you're ready to do this. Because there's no way that I would have volunteered myself to do this. Not in an environment where I didn't think, I didn't even have Dolores Van Cartier's credentials to be able to come in and to do what I'm doing today. But someone who was mature, someone who was already at work, believed that I could contribute to the team and that I had the rudiments to be able to do that. And I would also say that in our servantdom, we have to be not just fruit inspectors, but almost quality managers. And if you see that Sarah is presenting some skills that say that she's ready for the next rung, then by gone it, encourage her to do that. And what that means too, ultimately, is that we would not perhaps spend so much time building mega churches. When Sarah is ready with a certain skill set to do X and so, and we need to create a new shift of people in our midst to do that, then we put Sarah on the road to do that where she's going to be more effective. And that means if she's okay being in another location or doing that elsewhere or with another small group elsewhere, then we encourage her to do that. But we don't necessarily build an embarrassment of riches so that we just get to enjoy our own riches, because that's not what Jesus died for us to do. He died for us to make reproducible disciples who do this thing that Steve reminds us of, to obey all the things that Jesus instructed and commanded. And when we watch people doing that, we watch people growing, we watch people not caught off guard by being asked about their conduct, being asked about their opinion on Scripture, being asked how it should work, and also being asked to be transparent to say where you failed. Those people are ready for different assignments in the family of the Lord. So I'm kind of done there for our two questions that we're going to tackle. Go ahead if you got some feedback, and as we close out.
Hey, Preston, I wanted to say something about that very last thing. I was talking to a guy named Trent who lives out in the San Juan Islands in Washington State. And by the way, I'm going to encourage him to come hang out with us. He's kind of in between, and I've been discipling him a little bit. Guy's got great Bible knowledge. He's just trying to figure that next step out. But he said something to me last week about, he had a sense that perhaps he needed to go to seminary. And I said, you know what? That's a great idea. You'll learn a lot. And I said, but I've discovered that more than that, the best way to learn is to teach. And I said, I've been stretched more in having to teach than ever I was in seminary, to be honest with you. Because I just, instead of having to satisfy one professor's requirements, right, I got a whole bunch of professors in front of me I got to speak to. But, I'm always reminded of the back end of Hebrews 5, where he says, by now you should be teachers. And yet, what are we doing? We're needing to go back to the elementary stuff again and again and again. And I've gotten to this point that I'm really tired of just spoon feeding over and over and over again. And when you get to the point where you're teaching people and they're going, it's like, all right, well, if you know it that well, how about you teach this guy? Right? And I don't mean that in an ugly or unkind way. And I don't think that that necessarily, that passage necessarily means it's got to be you sitting in front of a group like this or something, but one other person, two other people, and just pouring your life back into them. I mean, golly day. We have people in churches across America that have been Christians for half a century who've never invested in another believer. That's sad. That's a terrible note to end on. There's time to change that.
So thank you again. We're in neat shape that the Lord has helped me have our next couple of studies ready. So, and I believe that all things have done are very interrelated in terms of being relevant. You guys get a big echo? Okay. Let me just continue and click back. So I don't know if it's me or. Okay, how's that? Nope, still there. All right. I got you, Sarah. Thank you. So having said that, we're going to study grace next. Slavery, servant. And then after that, we're going to study what does grace look like, what really applied to our lives. Because it's been my understanding that believers and church people struggle with grace. So we're going to try to go through it and make it understandable, make it relatable, make it real life languageable, and also have a little churchanese in there to just kind of make it balanced. But in many conversations I'm having these days with people that are churchgoers or even church Jesus professors, they use grace, but I don't really think that we understand what it really means in terms of the act, and then how we should have reverence for it, and then what it looks like applied to our lives daily. So it'll be fun to have that kind of volleying with our team when we get there. Having said that, we're going to be probably not necessarily closing out next week, but I want us to take a look. Our next couple of questions are going to be, what does obligated mean? How does it apply to you? And then where is your work arena and how far does it extend? That's going to be what we're going to tackle next week. Now, if we get a little bit further, we'll also have a little bit of fun with what's the difference between a Catholic saint and a saint. Because surprisingly, and I appreciate Gene's laughter there, surprisingly, there are church people who get, I can tell you that United Methodists, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans get really bogged down in this, and their understanding of saint almost becomes more of what the Roman Catholic understanding of a saint is, as opposed to what the Saint Paul that they reference all the time really means as a saint. And it's important to us, I think, to understand those things, because those come into servitude, that those come into slavery to Jesus, understanding that, because if there's a great gulf and a great divide over what constitutes a saint, then you're going to have a real tough time talking to Roman Catholics, talking to Episcopalians, talking to Lutherans, talking to United Methodists, who have a very different understanding of what a saint is. And we want you to be able, through at least this discussion, to not be inconvenienced and to go into boldness with a discussion to help folks understand what servitude is. And I'm going to say something radical, but you'll get it, and that they too can be saints. And even that might be a really good conversation starter with people when you tell them they can be and potentially are a saint. So that kind of fun is the stream I like to wade into to just get people talking. It's almost like that Bonnie Raitt song. People are talking, but she doesn't say this, talking about Jesus. And that's the way we do that, is by throwing something out there that's a truth of the scripture that we have almost eliminated in our understanding today. And that goes back to Terry. When Terry says church is supposed to be still and know that I am God. Yeah. When you're in your prayer closet. Yeah. When you are taking your private time. When you're in your car, when you can discuss with the Lord and converse with him at all times. Yeah. I would say, though, that when we get together, and let me add a little bit of Tina Turner to this, which is another great documentary that goes along with the Bible. Shake a tail feather when you get together for the Lord. Seacrest out. I'm going to pray.